Chapter 8 of Beyond the Rocks, a Love Story by Elinor Glyn. Theodora hummed to herself a glad little chansonnette as she changed her breakfast negligee for the freshest and loveliest of her spring frocks. She did not know why she was so happy. There had been no word of anyone else being of the party, only she and Mrs. McBride. But Versailles would be exquisite on such a day, and something whispered to her that she might not yawn. The most radiant vision awaited the widow, when, with unusual punctuality, her automobile stopped at the hotel door. She came in. She was voluble, she flattered Josiah. So good of him to take Mr. Tubbs, and she hoped it would not tire him. Theodora should be well looked after. They might be late and even dine at Versailles, she said, and Mr. Brown was not to be anxious. She would be responsible for the safe return of his beautiful little wife. Theodora was 5'7" at least, but her small head and extreme slenderness gave people the feeling she was little, something to be protected and guarded always. Josiah was affable. Mrs. McBride's words were so smooth and so many, he had no time to feel Theodora was going to dine out without him, or that anything had been arranged for ultimate ends. The automobile had reached Suresnes before the widow said to her guest, "Your father and Lord Bracondale have promised to meet us at the reservoirs. Captain Fitzgerald told me how you wanted to go to Versailles, and how your husband is not strong enough to take these excursions, so I thought we might have this little day out there, while he is engaged with Mr. Clutterbuck Tubbs." "How sweet of you," said Theodora. As they rushed through the smiling country, both women's spirits rose, and Mrs. McBride's were the spirits of experience, and did not mount without due cause. Since she had been a girl in Dakota and passionately in love with her first husband, the defunct McBride was a second venture. She had not met a man who could quicken her pulse like Captain Fitzgerald. It was a curious coincidence that they both had already two partners to regret. It was an extra link between them, and Jane McBride, who was superstitious, read the omen to mean that this time each had met his true mate. "If he is irresistible today, I think I shall clinch matters," she was saying to herself, while Theodora's musings ran, "How beautiful Versailles will look, and I dare say he will know all about its history and be able to tell me interesting things, and oh, I am so glad I put on this frock, and oh, I am so happy." And aloud they spoke of paradise plumes and the new gray, and the merits and demerits of Callot and Doucet and Jean Valet. And the widow said some bright American things about husbands and the world in general that conveyed crisp truths. The drive seemed all too short, and there were their two cavaliers in the courtyard awaiting them at the reservoirs, having arrived just before them. To the end of her life Theodora will remember that glorious May day. Its even minutest detail, the color of the chestnut trees, the tint of the sky, the scent in the air, every line of his figure and turn of his head, every look in his eyes, and they were many and varied, and also, and alas, every growing emotion in her own heart. But at the moment all was gladness and exquisite young, irresponsible joy, sans arrière-pensée or disquieting reflection. She wondered which of the two men was the handsomer as she got out of the automobile, dear darling papa or Lord Bracondale. Both were quite show creatures of their age, and both were of the same class and knowledge of savoir vivre. Every one said such polite and gracious things, it was all so smooth and gay, and it seemed so natural that they should take a turn up towards the chateau while breakfast was being prepared. 1:30 was time enough to eat, the widow said. "I want to show you a number of spots I love," Hector announced, choosing a different path to the other pair. "And it is a day we can be happy in, can't we?" "I want to be happy," said Theodora. "Then we shall go no farther now. We shall sit on this seat and admire the view. See, we are quite alone and undisturbed. All the world has gone home to breakfast." Then he looked at her, and though he really did try at this stage to be reasonable, something of the intense attraction he felt for her blazed in his eyes. She was sufficiently delectable a picture to turn the sagest head. There was something so absolutely pure white about that skin, it seemed good to eat, flawless, unlined, unblemished under this brilliant light. The way her silvery blonde hair grew was just the right way a woman's hair ought to grow, he thought, low on a high, broad brow, rippling and soft, and quantities of it. What could it be like to caress it? To run one's fingers through it, to bury one's face in it. Ah! And then there were her tender eyes, dewy and shadowed with dark lashes, and so intensely blue. His glance wandered further afield. Such a figure, slender and graceful and fine. There was something almost childish about it all, the innocent look of a very young girl, with the polish of the woman, garbed by an artist. It seemed the great pearls in her ears were not more milkily white than her throat, and he was sure were also her little slender hands that did not fidget but lay idly in her lap, holding her blue parasol. He would like to have taken off her gloves to see. Passionate devotion was surging up in his breast. And he was an Englishman, and it was still the morning. There was no moon now, and he had not even breakfasted. This shows sufficiently to what state he had come. "I want you to tell me all about Versailles," she said, looking to the left and the gray ring beyond the chapel. "Its histories and its meanings. I used to read about it all after Sarah brought me here once for our treat. But you probably are learned upon the subject, and I want to know." "I would much rather hear what you did when Sarah brought you here for your treat," he said. "Oh, it was a very simple day." And she leaned back and laughed softly at the recollection. "Papa was very hard up at that time, you know, and we were rather poor, so we came as cheaply as we could, Sarah Clementine and I, and I remember there were some very snuffy men in the train. We could not go first class, you see, and one of them rather frightened me." "The brute!" said Hector. "I think I was about 14. "And even then perfectly beautiful, I expect," he commented to himself. "We walked up from the station, and oh, we saw all the galleries, and we ran all over the park, but we missed the way to Trianon somehow, and never saw that, and when we got back here we were too tired to start again. We had only had sandwiches, you see, that we brought with us, and some funny little drinks at a café down there," and she pointed vaguely towards the lake, "because we found we had only 1 franc 50 between us all. But we were so happy, and Clementine knows a great deal, and told us many things which were quite different from what was in the guide books. But it seems so long, long ago. Do you know, it must be 6 years." And she looked at him seriously. "Half a lifetime," agreed Hector, with a whimsical smile. "Oh, you are laughing at me," she said, and there was a cloud in the blue stars which looked up at him. He made a movement nearer her, while his deep voice took every tone of tenderness. "Indeed, indeed I am not, you dear little girl. I love to hear of your day. I was only smiling to think that 6 years ago you were a baby child, and I was then an old man in feeling. Let me see, I was 25, and I was in Russia." He stopped suddenly. There were some circumstances which, sitting there beside her, he would rather not remember connected with Russia. This was one of the peculiarities of Theodora. There was something about her which seemed to wither up all low or vicious things. It was not that she filled people with ascetic thoughts of saints and angels and their mother in heaven, only she seemed suddenly to enhance simple joys with beauty and charm. They talked on for half an hour, and with every moment he discovered fresh qualities of sweetness and light in her gentle heart. She was not ill-educated either, but she had never speculated upon things. She took them for granted just as they were, and Jean de Grève was probably the only awakening book she had ever read. Hector all at once seemed to realize his mother's vision, and to understand for the first time what marriage might mean. That to possess this exquisite bit of God's finished work for his very own, to live with her in the country at Old Bracondale, to see her honored and adored, surrounded by little children, his children, would be a dream of bliss far, far beyond any dream he had ever known. A domestic, tender dream of sweetness that he had always laughed at before as a final thing when life's other joys should be over, and now it seemed suddenly to be the only heaven and completion of his soul's desire. Then he remembered Josiah Brown with a hideous pang of pain and bitterness, and they went in to lunch. Theodora was so gay. Captain Fitzgerald and Mrs. McBride were already seated when they joined them in the restaurant. Most of the other visitors had finished. It was almost 2:00. There was a good deal of black middle in the widow's eyes, Theodora noticed, and wondered to herself if she had had a happy and exciting hour too. Papa looked complacent and handsomer than ever, she thought. She did hope it was going well, and she wondered how they were to dispose of their afternoon. The widow soon settled this. She had, she said, a wild desire to rush through the air for a little. She must have her chauffeur go at full speed somewhere, anywhere. Her nerves needed calming. And Captain Fitzgerald had agreed to accompany her. Their destination was unknown, and they might not be back for tea, so Lord Bracondale must take the greatest care of Theodora and give her some if they did not turn up. They certainly would for dinner, but 8:00 would be time enough for that. When your destination is unknown, you can never say how many hours it will take to get there and back, she pointed out, and no one felt inclined to argue with her about this obvious truth. Now, if Theodora had been a free, unmarried girl, or a freer widow, it is highly probable fate would not have arranged this long afternoon in blissful surroundings undisturbed by anyone. As it was, who knows if the goddess settled it with a smile on her lip or a tear in her eye. It was settled at all events, and looked as if it were going to contain some moments worth remembering. End of chapter 8.